5 podcast from Northumbria Psychology Department. My name is Dr. Genevieve Brown, and I'll be your guide into the minds of psychology students, alumni, and researchers at Northumbria University. I'm a lecturer in the psychology department, and I study social psychology, or the science of how humans interact with one another. Each week on this podcast, I'll speak to a guest who is either a student, alumni, or researcher in the Northumbria Psychology Department. By asking them 5 big questions, we'll learn about their time studying psychology and hopefully learn some big facts about human behavior and experience. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking to my guest, Jennifer Merritt. Jen was a student at Northumbria from 2017 to 2020 and studied in our Psychology with Criminology program. And just full disclosure here, Jen was my project student for her level 6 dissertation in 2019 to 2020. So welcome, Jen.
Hi.
So we've got 5 big questions today, and we're going to be kind of focusing on your experience of the dissertation project. But I'd just like to start with asking you, why did you decide to study psychology?
I think when I first came to uni, it was just a subject that I was interested in. I thought I'd enjoy. I'd done it at A level, so I was just like, I think I want to carry that on. I think as the course progressed, I kind of realised I wanted to do a career in it rather than it was just something I was doing at uni. I'm kind of interested in how psychological therapies can facilitate recovery and rehabilitation. So I've kind of decided I want to go into the clinical side.
Excellent. And what was it like studying psychology at Northumbria? And if you could specifically, maybe talk about some courses that you really enjoyed, but also talk about your dissertation and what the experience of that was like.
Yeah, well, I enjoyed studying it at uni. I've obviously gone on to do a master's and I've kind of continued to study psychology. I think when I first started, I was kind of unaware of how research-based psychology was. So when I was in first year and you did research methods and stats, I was like, what is this? I didn't realise I would be doing maths. But I think I've enjoyed that side. So I enjoyed stats and research in first and second year, but I think I've really started to enjoy it in third year when I was doing my projects and it was a bit more independent and you could sort of pick what you wanted to research. And I think kind of from that, I've developed different research interests that I kind of want to pursue in my career.
So can you tell us a little bit more about some of those research interests?
Yeah, so obviously I did my project. It was about narcissism and social media and kind of the influence that power had in that relationship. So I'm kind of still interested in that. I've obviously been working with yourself to do some follow-up research about audience size and power and how that affects how people perceive themselves to be powerful online and stuff. So I'm still interested in that. I think obviously I mentioned how I want to go into the clinical side. I'm quite interested in the role that social media has in young people who develop eating disorders. That's kind of something that I would like to research in the future. And obviously you mentioned that I did psychology with criminology. So I am interested in the impact of trauma and offending behaviour. That's an interest that I've kind of developed. But just research in general, I think I just enjoy it. I like how you kind of can put a research project together. So I just kind of want to continue doing research in my career, really.
What is it specifically about research that you enjoy so much?
I think I enjoy working independently. So it's quite nice, kind of just coming up with what you want to research and then going through the whole process. And obviously the findings, when you find something interesting, that's obviously a bonus. Writing up research, I quite enjoy doing that. I think I've kind of, from doing the third year project and then doing my master's, I've kind of developed how I write up a research project. And I think from developing them skills, it's more enjoyable because I kind of know how to do it now.
Speaking of exciting things, what was the most exciting or surprising thing you found from your dissertation? And can you just tell our listeners a bit about how the study was run and what variables were measured and what you found in the end?
Yeah, so my project examined the relationship between narcissistic traits and different behaviours on social media, and then whether that was mediated by power, so whether power kind of caused that relationship. So I looked at a lot of different behaviours on social media, but the ones that I actually found significant effects for were number of Facebook friends, number of Instagram followers, and number of likes on Instagram as well. So from that, my interesting finding was kind of that narcissistic traits kind of occurred when people had bigger audiences and that power mediated that. So power was kind of influenced by audience size. That was obviously kind of my suggested finding and future research kind of needed to be conducted, and obviously you're following that up, so that's obviously interesting, and hopefully your follow-up research would find significant effects for that as well.
Yeah. Were you surprised by the findings? Because I know when we started the project, you had some other kind of hypotheses about, I think you had some about using filters, or there were some other hypotheses that you had that maybe weren't validated. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think I ran a few different mediations, and obviously the ones that were significant were mostly about audience size, which was kind of expected, but it was quite interesting. There was also a lot of effects that only were significant for Instagram rather than Facebook. So then that kind of showed, differences on different social media platforms. That was quite interesting. But yeah, there was some that came back as non-significant that I was expecting to come back as significant. I think it was sort of like using hashtags to kind of like make your audience bigger, and using filters to kind of obviously promote yourself in a better way. They came back as non-significant, didn't kind of correlate with narcissistic traits, which was obviously surprising, but that kind of happens when you're doing research, that your hypotheses that you expect sometimes aren't met.
Yeah, I found that very interesting too. So it seems like, one thing when we do a mediation, we don't know which direction the relationship is. So we proposed
Mhm.
larger audience leads to greater feelings of power, which then leads to kind of more narcissistic or self-involved traits. And some people might say, well, wouldn't narcissists want to have a larger audience size to give them more power? And they put the relationship in that direction. But the fact that the use of hashtags wasn't correlated with it, that could maybe point to the fact that it is something about having this larger audience that's really directing that feeling of power, which then leads to
Yeah,
narcissism.
definitely.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, I found that very interesting as well. But also, I wonder how common that behavior is. One thing about studying social media is we just don't have a ton of data on what people tend to do. So that's something we need to look into.
Yeah,
Thank
definitely.
you for that. So, we're coming into a new academic year, things are gearing up. What advice might you give to other students about conducting the project, about their studies at Northumbria? What kind of wisdom can you pass on? Because you've been very successful after your program, you're very successful during your program. What kind of advice can you give to students who are just starting their studies at Northumbria or who are starting their level 6 project?
Um, I think like in terms of the level 6 project, so obviously students going into third year now, they'll have probably been told to kind of think about their idea over summer. And I think it can be like initially quite daunting. Like you need to think of an idea, and sometimes you've got an idea of what you're interested in, but you don't have to kind of make that a study. So I think it's just kind of important you don't have to have a fully formed research question when you first go to meet your supervisor. You can just have things that you're interested in. And that's quite important because you've got to work on it all year. So you kind of need to be interested in it. You spend so much time in it, you kind of need to enjoy it. So I think just initially come up with some vague ideas, decide what you're interested in, and kind of take that to your supervisor, and they can kind of help you formulate your entire project. So I think that's important. I think time management as well, that was something that I probably wasn't amazing at before I went to do my third year project, but definitely kind of developed that through it, because there's not really many deadlines. So obviously, I don't know if it's still the case, but we handed in a little proposal mid-year.
Yes.
Um, so that's really the first deadline you've got, and then you don't have anything else until you have to hand your project in. So I think it would be quite easy to kind of neglect to do much until the deadlines come around. But I think it's definitely important to start early, particularly with like reading. That's quite time consuming. And I kept like a literature grid. So write down like what studies you've read, what was important from them, and then you can go back to it. And if it's in Word, like you can type the author's name in and find exactly what you found important from that study without having to read the whole paper again. Because
Yeah.
if you read it in September and then you're writing in March, you're probably not going to be able to remember. So I think that's important. But yeah, in terms of just the whole uni experience, like advice, I'd just say like obviously if you're going into first or second year and you're finding like research methods quite hard, I think everyone does. So kind of just persevere with it. And I mean, I use the Andy Fields book for stats. That was really helpful. And I think just like the more you do it, the more like research projects you sort of do throughout like lab groups in first and second year, like the better prep you'll be for third year. So it's not as daunting as it seems like it's going to be when you get to it.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. Even now as a researcher, I'm still learning things. So I think it's an iterative process and you just learn through practice and trial and error. And Yeah, you just got to get plugged in and try some things out. Absolutely. And I
Definitely.
really like the idea of your literature grid. That is a very good idea. Yeah, even for coursework, I think, if you're doing extra reading in your courses and you're gonna have to write an essay at the end, something like that can be super helpful.
Yeah, I still use that. Like in my master's, I've done that for pretty much every essay, and it's definitely beneficial.
Yeah. Our memories are limited capacity, so
Yeah.
it's good to take notes. Yeah, so just one more big question here.
Hmm.
So, where do you hope to go from here? I know you've completed a master's program since you graduated in 2020. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what your plans for the future are?
Yeah, so I've done my master's this year. It was in forensic psychology, which is why I didn't do it at Northumbria because they don't offer that course. So I really enjoyed doing that. Obviously, I've done another like level 7 project. It was in a totally different area, so I've quite enjoyed doing more research, but in a different like sort of area. Really, it was just interesting to kind of do something different. In terms of like career wise, I've just got a new job in like a CAM service within the NHS. So obviously that's more like the clinical side. So I'm kind of going to go down that route for now. I'm sort of hoping to get an assistant psychologist job within the NHS at some point. And obviously once I got into that kind of role, there would be more research based work, which I would be quite excited to pick back up again. In terms of research at the minute, obviously I've been helping yourself with like making materials for your follow-up study and things, and that what kind of follows on from some of the findings that I found in my undergraduate research. So obviously I'm continuing to do that, and that's exciting. So hopefully that study would get some significant results. But yeah, that's kind of where I'm going for now. And I guess I'm just going to kind of see what comes along.
Yeah, that's great. Keep the doors open for opportunities.
Yeah.
Can you just tell us? I'm really curious. What study did you do for your master's level project?
So obviously, like my master's kind of focused on like psychology, and it was very much like offending psychology. So I did my project on public perceptions of different types of sex offenders, and I focused on whether people's perceptions differed between just a sex offender who had sort of no history of any diagnosis of any mental health problems or learning disabilities, and then I used another offender who had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, and then another one who had a diagnosis of autism, to see whether like anything differed between those. I actually didn't find any significant results, so that was quite unexpected. I didn't expect that all the previous literature sort of pointed to that there's a lot of stigma within like disorders, and that would kind of affect people's perceptions. But yeah, non-significant results.
It happens. It happens. Maybe that's a good sign that people's attitudes towards people with mental illnesses are changing as well.
Yeah, literally, I touched on that within my discussion, sort of like it was good that an offender with autism wasn't sort of viewed differently, because if you think from like a rehabilitation point of view, when that offender gets back into the community, they don't want to face any sort of additional stigmatization.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I also wanted to know more about your job that you're starting now. How did you get hired into the NHS? Because I know that's a great option for a lot of our graduates. How did you find yourself on that path? How did you hear about the job? How did you apply? What was that process like?
Yeah, so I've kind of been keeping an eye on NHS jobs for quite a while, and that's sort of the main platform that you use to apply for jobs within the NHS. They also have another platform called Track, and you can go on that, and that shows you like all the vacancies, and you can actually set up email alerts, so it tells you when sort of jobs come up that you're interested in. So I had mine set for any sort of support worker role or assistant psychologist jobs within CAMS, which is obviously child and adolescent mental health. Just because I actually did a placement this year. I kind of arranged it independently. It wasn't through uni, but that was within a specialist school. So I worked with children for about 4 months this year. So it was just the direction I felt like I should be going in. I sort of had the experience with that client group. And when you apply on NHS jobs, you have a person specification and you write a supporting statement to show how you meet those points. So some of the person specifications are quite sort of long. There is a lot to meet on them. So obviously if you've got experience with a client group, that's quite beneficial. So I kind of just thought if I try and get into CAMS, that'll be sort of my foot in the door within the NHS, could kind of lead to assistant psychologist roles. So yeah, that's kind of how I got into that. Obviously you've got to write a supporting statement, and that can be quite time consuming. So I applied to quite a few before I even got an interview. And I think sometimes you don't even hear back. So it can be quite sort of off-putting, but I think you just have to like persevere with it. And every time you write a supporting statement, kind of change it for what the job you're applying for. And obviously eventually you will hear back and manage to get in. I think it's just quite like competitive. So you've just got to kind of persevere.
Mm. And so after the interview, is that when you got the job, or were there multiple interviews?
No, so I just had the one interview. I think because the role I've got is a support worker role. I think assistant psychologist roles are sometimes a little bit more competitive, like they have longer interview processes. I think I've heard a few people have had to do presentations and role plays and things like that. But I think it does all just depend kind of where you're working, what service and stuff. But yeah, so I just had the one interview. Obviously, it was kind of only a couple of months ago, so it was on Teams. I didn't have to actually go in. But I just had the one interview and they literally let me know the same day. And if I hadn't have got it, they give you like feedback. So I've heard from a few other people that the interview feedback is quite positive. So even if you're not successful in an interview, I think it's still beneficial to kind of have had the experience, and then you can work on what to do next for another interview.
Yeah, absolutely. And what will you be doing in your new role as a support worker? Do you know what your responsibilities are going to be?
Yeah, so I think it's an inpatient unit. So it's an inpatient unit for children between 12 and 18, and they can have a range of mental health problems, but the service that I'm working in does actually specialise in eating disorders. So I haven't actually started yet, but I presume quite a lot of the clients there are going to have eating disorders. So it's a lot of observations, so sort of just checking what they're doing, making sure they're okay, and also mealtime observations, so helping them obviously with their meals if they've sort of got an eating disorder. And then I think just sort of like activities really. So obviously it's an inpatient unit, so they're there mostly all the time. They go on family leave and stuff, but just any sort of activities, anything to kind of engage them in things. And obviously they'll have therapeutic work with sort of the psychologist. So that's kind of not really going to be my role, but I'm sort of hoping from a support worker role, I can kind of get a bit of an insight to that side of it as well, and sort of develop and then be able to apply for them kind of roles.
Excellent. That sounds very interesting. Sounds like a great opportunity. I would like to thank our guest, Jen Merritt, so much for coming and speaking to us today. I hope that the information she has given will be helpful to current and perhaps future students as well. And Jen, where can people find you online?
I'm on LinkedIn. It's just my name, Jen Merritt. So if anyone wants to connect, that's totally fine.
All right. So if you'd like to reach out to Jen, you can find her on LinkedIn. If you'd like to learn more about Northumbria Psychology, check out our psychology department blog at northumbriapsy.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at NorthumbriaPSY. If you want, you can follow me on Twitter to keep updated on information about episodes at Brown Genevieve, Genavee. If you'd like to be interviewed on the podcast or know someone who would, please email me at genevieve.brown@northumbria.ac.uk. Finally, if you liked the podcast, make sure to subscribe to our podcast on your listening app and give us a review and rating. I hope you've learned something on this voyage into the mind. Take care until next time.